I'm a caretaker for a cemetery, which means that I practically live amongst the dead. I've seen some strange things during my time here. By strange, I mean sometimes human, sometimes supernatural. Ghosts aren't an uncommon occurrence, to be honest, and while you probably don't believe me, I find disbelief in the face of what is obvious to me irrelevant. Ghosts only come out after nightfall, but it's usually only a handful, and the same ones, those who have unresolved business. They frightened me at first, and then I learned to ignore them, which made my life easier for a while. But this cemetery is home to more than just ghosts and glassy-eyed corpses. Of course, until a few weeks ago, I would have been ignorant to the fact. One rainy night, I was walking up the hill, and toward the small cluster of graves where I had often sit and eat my lunch. Apparently, something had already started eating. One of the graves had been dug up, and this muscular creature, resembling a human, but with wings and wolf's eyes. The thing was eating the corpse like a starved dog. I screamed and I ran back to the worksman cabin. I basically lived there, so I kept a whole host of useful items stashed away in case of emergencies. Except none of what I had in the little cabin would have been of use to me. Another worker who was thereabouts as often as myself, a middle-aged man named Trevor, had many bizarre possessions in the cabin. The one that stood out to me the most was a flare gun. I grabbed it, loaded a flare, and ran back towards the hill. The winged creature was gone, leaving me to stare at a pile of dirt and a partially eaten corpse. I spent the rest of the night cleaning up the mess, placing the body back into the almost wrecked coffin, shoving it clumsily back into the grave, and then filling up the grave with dirt. I left right around sunrise. I thought about how lucky I was that the owner rarely came around here. Sure, I had cleaned up the mess, but if he had shown up, he would have noticed the freshly covered grave on the hill. When Trevor showed up the following night, I explained to him what had happened. I didn't have much trouble convincing him because he encountered those aimless ghosts before, so maintaining disbelief at that point wouldn't have been very logical. What reason would I have to lie? Always honest, I told him I took my flare gun for protection, and asked him if I could borrow it tonight. He hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Just be careful with it," Trevor said. You see, Trevor was territorial about his possessions. My assumption would be that he didn't have much else in his life. I try not to judge, but that's just my observation. Anyway, I took Trevor's flare gun and I told him that I was going to sit on the hill until I found something. If he wanted his flare gun back, he knew where to find it. That elicited a quick smile from him, and so I left. I sat on the hill for almost 2 hours, bringing my jacket tighter around me as the cold wind increased. Honestly, I was about to doze off when I heard a digging sound, more like frantic scratching at the dirt. I jolted awake. The winged creature was back. It did seem like the same one as before, but I couldn't be sure. As I stifled a scream, the winged creature kept on digging. It dug at the same spot too, the same grave. I fumbled with the flare gun, firing it with shaking hands. The flare connected with the winged beast. Its shriek echoed throughout the cemetery. I thought that it would have killed the damn thing, but apparently not. The creature's wings flapped at an incredible speed, extinguishing the fire. It must have been badly injured though, because its skin looked charred. I stood there, my whole body shaking. I let the flare gun drop as the creature gave one final shriek before disappearing into the woods behind the cemetery. Its charred wings seemed to spread to unnatural length, yet somehow avoiding all the trees behind the final crescent of tombstones. "Trevor!" I yelled. "Trevor, get over here quick!" And then it occurred to me that yelling for him was stupid because the workman's cabin was pretty far away from my current point. And so I ran back to the cabin. But I didn't see any sign of Trevor here. Everything seemed to be in a state of disarray though, which struck me as odd because Trevor always made a noticeable effort to keep his workplace immaculate. All of his tools lay on the floor in random fashion, and I picked them up, inspecting them, seeing if I could find any clue as to why Trevor apparently took off in such a hurry or had been taken. The tools themselves failed to illuminate anything, but I found something of interest in the bookcase Trevor insisted on keeping in the cabin. Many of the books weren't really worth taking a look at, but one stood out, titled "Angels in Their Many Forms, From Darkness to Light." I thumbed through the book, realizing that many of the chapters didn't make any sense because I didn't have any context. So I went back to the table of contents. The very first chapter, on the difference between heaven's angels and angels conjured by man. I could hardly believe what I was reading. I knew there was some hokey stuff out there, in the form of various mystical books, but this talked about the dark side of angels in such a candid and authentic way that I couldn't help but believe it in the moment. According to the book, ghosts could transform into fallen angels. I wondered why it had to be fallen, but then the next sentences answered my question. In order to become an angel fully, the ghost had to devour its own corpse. With each portion of its flesh eaten, the ghost would become more angel-like, celestial, but in a way damned and fallen. Trevor always came across like he was into some weird shit, but I never knew his beliefs were this bizarre. Before I could reflect on what I had read, I heard the cracking of twigs, work boots gliding across the grass. "Dave, what are you doing just standing there?" Trevor's voice came from behind me. I put the book quickly in my coat. I knew I needed to read more of the book, and I wasn't sure if Trevor would agree to lend it to me. I had every intention of giving it back. "I saw that thing again, the creature. I ran back here to see if I could find you." Trevor sighed. "It's been a hell of a night for the both of us. I heard some rustling in shady fields and I went to check it out. No one was there though, just a knocked over tombstone." "Mrs. Marshall?" I asked and turned around. Trevor nodded and gave a slight smile. "That tough old bird keeps getting knocked over. Not sure why. Anyway, I put everything back the best I could." Trevor wanted his flare gun back, but I asked if I could keep it because I didn't think I came even close to killing that thing. I loaded another flare into the gun and I put a couple extra into my large coat pockets. Trevor said that he was going to straighten up, and I really didn't feel like hanging out on the cabin any longer than I needed to. The disarray made my head spin. Though I thought it best to go back to Miss Marshall's gravestone and make sure that nothing had disturbed it. I thought of the winged creature again, how it devoured the flesh of a long dead corpse. I still couldn't wrap my head around an angel doing that, even a fallen one. Miss Marshall's grave stood crookedly against the light of a full-blood moon, and I could see where Trevor had hastily propped the thing back up and piled the dirt around it. The long lightning-shaped crack that always existed on the tombstone seemed to collide with another jagged crack on the stone's left side, which looked new to me. What the hell? I remember saying to myself, what the hell caused that? And why didn't Trevor mention it? Maybe he didn't notice because the moon's light might have been obscured by a cloud, I thought. Now with the moon looking huge and almost otherworldly, I considered this a perfect reading spot. I would hear Trevor coming from a mile off and I would place the book back in my coat. I had left off at the process by which ordinary ghosts became angels. I sat down and I opened the book, shifting to where the moonlight was the brightest. It occurred to me that I had abandoned the grave where the angel chose to dig up, the grave that contained its corpse, presumably. The book went on to talk about the difference between these fallen angels who were once regular specters. They weren't like the celestial kind. After the devouring of their own corpse, they needed to keep replenishing their constitution by eating more flesh. "You're in way over your head," the ghost of Mrs. Marshall said from behind me. I screamed and I tossed the book in the air. It landed on my head. "Shit! You scared me, Mrs. Marshall," I replied. "Don't ever do that." "Oh, I'm sorry, Dave, but I consider you the son I never had. I just don't want you to do anything stupid." "Thanks for the vote of confidence." "No, I meant that I've been in the cemetery a lot longer than you. I've seen creatures like this come and go and come again." "Come again?" I asked. "What are you talking about?" Miss Marshall glared at me. "Sorry for the language," I said. "Oh, it's alright. But you need to understand what you're up against. The fallen angel that you're after, he's been here before. The cemetery kept changing hands because the managers couldn't figure out what was digging up all the corpses and eating them. Eventually, this angel left. He took flight before you started to work here." "Okay, so he left. Why is he coming back?" "Well, clearly he's hungry." Mrs. Marshall smiled, but it wasn't an evil smile. More out of satisfaction that she said something witty. "What I'm trying to get at is that he is no aspiring angel. He's full-fledged and looking to feed again. Read that book like your life depends on it." And so I did. I started on the next chapter, which explains what happened to these angels. These artificial angels didn't automatically retain their angel status. After so long, they had to go on a sort of feeding frenzy to retain their celestial flesh. During this period, they could be killed by mortals, but they were extra dangerous because of the frenzied state that they were in. What could kill them? Repeated exposure to fire, but this would take some time. The book described a fire sword, an ancient weapon that could deal some serious damage. Okay. The only logical conclusion would be to look through Trevor's possessions and see if it was anywhere in the workman's cabin. I mean, he owned this weird book about angels. I knew of no one else who might potentially have the sword. I got up and I brushed the dirt off of my jeans. I made my way down the hill. I scanned in the semi-darkness for the winged creature. I didn't see anything at first, and I blew out a sigh of relief, but then I saw the darkness move. It came from the area where I had encountered the angel devouring a corpse. Initially, I had thought that it was on its own, but if the thing had attained angel status in the first place, then it must have been someone else's. I took out the flare gun without thinking and I fired it into the moving darkness. It lit up like a burning tree, and I ran to the workman's cabin, locking the door behind me. I heard a loud noise coming from outside. Not right next to the door, but close enough. It sounded like the rapid flying of wings bigger than my arms. Needless to say, I was very confused and terrified in that moment. I rummaged through the clutter of the books and some of the tools that had fallen to the floor, more like tossing them aside. I really didn't know what the hell I was doing. But once I cleared away all the clutter from most of the clutter, I spotted something which boggled me why I hadn't seen it before. It was a circular handle covered in rust. Like I said, I still don't know why I never saw it before. If I'm remembering right, Trevor kept his push mower in that corner. I'm also not sure why my memory is so fuzzy all of a sudden. Maybe it's with this particular part of the story because it seems to be returning. I held the fire sword in my hand. I found it down below, but the space is a blank spot in my mind. Completely blank. I remember holding the fire sword in my hands with crystal clarity. Mrs. Marshall's ghost appeared then, looking worried, almost grief-stricken. "Be careful with that thing," Mrs. Marshall said. "I know you want to get rid of that creature yourself, but there are certain places you can't stab him. Read the book again. It will be your salvation." I could feel the power of the fire sword coursing through my veins. It got harder and harder to pay attention to what Mrs. Marshall was saying. The angel appeared in front of the cabin's only window, but I wasn't able to see its face. "Dave, Dave," it said, and then as its wings moved furiously, a cloud of dirt and leaves completely covered the window so it was impossible to see outside. Even as the flapping of the wings ceased, the dirt remained on the windows. I felt claustrophobic, eyes darting around the room, looking for a means of escape. Who just shook her head. "You're wasting valuable time, David. Read the book," Mrs. Marshall said. I knew she had a point, but she seemed to know so much I wasn't sure why she couldn't tell me directly. Now, I'm still trying to remember what happened to me after I went down that set of stairs. Whatever happened, Mrs. Marshall treated me differently from before. "Read the book, David." And so I did. There was so much mythology that I don't think I really understood it. But the chapter on how to use the heavenly weapon, it really helped. The fire sword was a weapon of damnation. It functioned as both a holy and unholy weapon at the same time. It could only be used at night. One requirement down. The moon had to strike the blade for a minimum of 3 seconds. This would charge the weapon. The battle needs to occur at the ceremonial mound of the earth. My mind instantly went to the hill where I saw the man-made angel digging up a corpse. At the end of the chapter, it suggested that the rest of the chapters should be read as well. They weren't required to use the fire sword, and so I closed the book and I grabbed it. "Are you so quick to mete out justice?" Mrs. Marshall asked. "Knowledge is just as important as being able to use the fire sword." "You've always been a mentor to me, but I'm afraid if I wait much longer, the angel will leave, and who knows what kind of havoc it'll cause." I left the cabin and I made my way to the hill. The moon seemed a dark red now, and I decided to wait at the apex of the hill until the winged creature showed up. My eyes fixed on the moon. Before long, a winged shadow flew past the large red orb and landed with a strange grace behind the set of graves facing me. Once it stepped into the moonlight, I gasped at the sight. "You look so surprised," Trevor said. His body looked different than usual. Not that of a middle-aged man, but an angel, without flaw. Even fallen angels seemed perfect in comparison to mortals. It made sense. Trevor had the book on angels, and up until that point, I thought he had studied them so that he could kill the fallen ones. But things seemed to click then. He moved Mrs. Marshall's gravestone after the initial encounter, so he could try and further obscure the trapdoor which led into the abyss that contained the fire sword, the weapon that could kill him. "I always knew you were a weirdo, Trevor, but I never quite expected this," I said. "Ignorant mortal," Trevor replied. "The majesty of the night and that sword from hell won't save you. You do not know that which you wield. You are lucky you came to the hill when you did. One more corpse and I would have had my fill." The moonlight gleamed in his eyes, and off the perfectly sculpted silver of my sword. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Standing on this hill as you wielded the sword, I was forced to answer its summons. You think you have the upper hand. Hubris always teaches a lesson, always. I call it Trevor's Law," Trevor said, smiling a wicked grin. Trevor's eyes turned to slits and then he lunged at me, becoming almost completely shadow again. But my blade had been fully charged by the blood of the red moon. I thrust the fire sword forward, and Trevor's shadow form to dodge the blade. He kept emerging from the bare tree branches above my head, lunging at me and spinning at a supernatural speed. The blade eventually connected with his chest, and my wrist exploded in pain because his flesh was apparently more layered than regular human flesh, so it took more strength for the sword to enter. Trevor let out an inhuman scream, which seemed to fill the entire cemetery. He burst into a white-hot flame. I pulled back and dropped the sword because my hands began to burn. There was another curious sensation. Something seemed like it was separating my body. I saw it in my mind's eye, a brilliant, blinding shape that gave me a quick look of anger before it fled into the trees. My focus quickly returned to the column of flames becoming shorter and shorter, and only a pile of ash was left. Silence reigned for several minutes. "Are you happy, David? You have vanquished your foe, but at what cost?" Mrs. Marshall said, emerging from the shadows that separated the hill from the rest of the cemetery. "I don't know why you're admonishing me, Mrs. Marshall. I defeated Trevor. I killed an angel. What does that make me? An angel killer? Closer to gods, maybe." Mrs. Marshall didn't say anything for a moment. She floated closer, wings stretched from behind her back, glistening in the moonlight. It was then that everything became clear. I should have listened to her. I'm not sure why, but my head fell to her chest and I cried. I seemed to be mourning a loss, something beyond the committing the sin of murder. I followed her floating form, descended the hill and made my way to the workman's cabin. I'm feeling a sense of sorrow as I type this. It's probably what is helping me remember. I felt a deep sense of shame as I walked towards the workman's cabin. Mrs. Marshall floated in the cabin and halted near the book. I'm not allowed to tell you your punishment. I can say that knowledge is sometimes a punishment itself. I picked up the book and I read the chapters that I neglected. The ones that had been recommended in the chapter about the fire sword. Mrs. Marshall was right. I should have read them before I charged into that hill. Shit. And that's the understatement of the year. The fire sword can only be claimed in the abyss. It's a place, a shadowy place where the Prince of Darkness reigns. He waits to grant the sword to anybody who asks, but the sword comes at a price. Typically, most who take the fire sword don't read the fine print in the book. If they did, a simple incantation would release them from the soul-separating forces that are released when the owner uses its blade. So, my hubris damned my soul to blindly roaming the cemetery. I chased after it every night, and Mrs. Marshall just shakes her head. My soul is trying to eat corpses. It doesn't know what it's doing. It needs to devour me. The problem is, I'm alive when ghosts get hungry. They only get hungry for corpses. I'm technically still living, and this means that my soul will wander that cemetery at night for eternity, looking for things that are already dead, or until I die, without hope of becoming an angel. Mrs. Marshall said that if I lose some of my hubris, my soul might come back to my body. I've tried to be humble, but honestly, it gets a bit boring after a while. Maybe I should just end it all. That way, my soul eats my corpse and I can become an angel. I'm afraid of doing it though. Will my dead flesh become repulsive to my ghost? I just want to move on from becoming a caretaker of the cemetery. Move on to bigger and better things. But I'm scared. What if what happened to Trevor happens to me? There are so many dark possibilities if you think about it.